Evening, everyone. My paper is titled Carbon Sovereignty and Regional Solidarity, the Political Economy of Green Industrialization under the AfCFTA. Now, it examines how Africa can use carbon taxation not just as an environmental tool, but as a driver for industrial development and competitiveness within the AfCFTA framework. As you know, the AfCFTA is Africa's largest regional integration initiative, and it aims at removing trade barriers, but also to create single market systems. At the same time, global economies are rapidly changing and shifting due to climate policies. An example of this is the EU CBAM, which will tax high carbon exports. Now, if Africa continues to act individually, we risk carbon leakages, fragmented rules, which will harm investment, and a loss of competitiveness in global markets. Sorry, I forgot to flip the slide. So the central argument of my paper is that a coordinated carbon tax framework under the AfCFTA can turn these risks into opportunities. By harmonizing policies, we can drive green industrialization, we can protect Africa's trade investments, and we can generate revenue to reinvest into green projects and into just transition programs. Now, in my paper, I looked at 3 case studies: South Africa, Kenya, and Morocco. South Africa was the first to implement a carbon tax policy back in 2019. What we proved is that a phased-in approach works. Kenya, with over 90% renewable power, is now looking at the carbon tax policy, but this is only to expand their own green industrial portfolio. And Morocco is invested heavily into renewables without a carbon tax policy, but are now looking at the carbon tax policy because of EU trade pressure. So together they show that external trade dynamics, institutional capacity, and political economy shape what is possible and why the coordination under the AfCFTA is necessary and needed. My paper proposed a 3-phased approach. 2025 to 2027, we build consensus, create a model carbon tax framework, and strengthen technical capacity. 2028 to 2033, we launch national pilots, develop regional carbon pricing corridors, and establish continental green fund development funds. 2034 to 2040, we adopt a regional carbon price floor and create our own African carbon border adjustment mechanism and fully integrate the pricing mechanism into the AfCFTA trade protocols. Now, to conclude, the AfCFTA is not just a trade agreement. It can be used as a platform for Africa's low-carbon transformation. A harmonized carbon tax system would strengthen sovereignty, protect competitiveness, and mobilize resources for just transition. The key message in my paper is simple. Africa can industrialize through the climate transition, not in spite of it. But it will require collective and strategic development. Thank you.
Thanks, Dale, for your insights on that. I will have a couple of questions, and I definitely will abuse my role as moderator for this session, especially given the topic. Our next speaker is Muhammed Patel, who will be presenting on green hydrogen and industrial development. Thanks, Muhammed.
So I'll make sure everyone can hear me. Okay, great. Yeah, so for some of the people that know me, like green hydrogen has been keeping me ticking for the past couple of years. We've been very interested in it at TIPS, and trying to understand the technology, trying to understand the role, the benefits for South Africa, and perhaps our role in the global stage, on the global stage rather. particularly as it relates to our sustainable transition and our decarbonization journey. So for today, I mean, the topic seems to be quite vague and general, but I'll just go through some of maybe, you know, the global story, what's happening at the moment, what's going on in South Africa, some of the challenges that we might see when we think about developing the green hydrogen value chain. And then I'll end off a bit, you know, given there's a regional focus and theme to this event, with some possible you know, levers that or opportunities that we could look at from a regional perspective. So yeah, I mean, that's just essentially the overview that I've just went through. So one thing to take note of is that at the current point in time, there is a lot of global interest in green hydrogen. And, you know, I've pulled this from the IEA, their latest hydrogen review. Sorry, I keep looking back. I shouldn't do that. From their latest hydrogen review, and we can see that there's a lot of interest. The size of the squares and the circles in this case indicate the size of, in terms of capacity of the projects. But an important thing to note is that almost all of the projects, or a very high proportion of the projects, are early stage. So they're either testing green hydrogen production at a specific scale, or they're testing the use of green hydrogen in specific applications and end uses. But the point that we're making is that globally, this market is still at a very early stage. And while initially around 2019, 2020, there was a lot of hype, and it's carried on over the last couple of years, we're starting to see a bit more of a sharpening lens in terms of, you know, what are the practicalities, what are the challenges, what are the risks around the technology, and where does it have a clear benefit, where is there still some work that needs to be done. So just to track some of the global developments, there's been a lot of progress on the supply side, specifically around the production of the electrolyzers, which is a core component of green hydrogen production. There's a lot that's hidden behind this that I won't exactly go through. So for example, you know, there's different methods of production for producing green hydrogen via electrolysis. There's the older, more incumbent alkaline systems. There's the newer proton exchange membrane systems. But the important, I guess, point there for South Africa is that the PEM-based systems, the proton exchange membrane systems, are the ones that use platinum as a catalyst. So then that for the production of that specific component, for that technology, South Africa does have some advantages in terms of our platinum resources. But the general point is that there's different technologies, you know, there's different technologies that are adopted based on different use cases, based on the scale of the projects, whether you want to have modularity in the projects, etc. Another point is that China is emerging as a key manufacturing base. So already about 60% of electrolyzers, the heart of the production process, is produced in China. And in the past couple of years, we've seen an interesting sort of diversification or reorientation. So where you have firms that were originally producing renewable energy components for solar and wind, also now diversifying to produce green hydrogen components as well. And I give some examples of some of the firms in their presentation. A lot of the committed projects are mainly in industry or to produce hydrogen-based fuels for transport, specifically for heavy-duty, long-range transport, which is where the competitive edge comes in for hydrogen-based transport. So, I mean, the South African story can be traced back, you know, as far as 2007, with the birth of HISA and DSI's involvement in really looking at new ways of diversifying the use for platinum and the creation of the hydrogen industry. There's been a lot of research effort at various universities across the country around this. You know, this sort of culminated in 2020, 2021 with the development of the Hydrogen Society Roadmap, which is a key policy document that, you know, outlays South Africa's competitive advantage. It puts into place some targets that we can possibly think about in terms of electrolyzer capacity, hydrogen-based vehicles, etc. But as I'll mention here, as was mentioned in perhaps if you were there at the previous presentations earlier on, South Africa does have some key capabilities when it comes to green hydrogen production. We've got good solar and wind potential across the country, much better than in parts of Europe where green hydrogen is currently being produced at small scale. We've got a big coastline and ports. We've got access to the Fischer-Tropsch technology, which is imbibed in Sasol, which allows for integration of green hydrogen with existing fossil-based hydrogen systems. And we've got access to PGMs, which are a key component in the PEM-based technology route. So another point to bear in mind is that green hydrogen is seen as a sort of central solution in certain hard to abate value chains. So when we're talking about iron and steel, heavy transport, maritime transport, aviation, green hydrogen seems to hold a central role in the future decarbonization of some of those value chains. So given these advantages, one can take the position that South Africa has a clear case to make for getting involved in this value chain and for developing it. However, we need to also think about what is the scale of that ambition in terms of how global markets and the views towards the uses of green hydrogen have been evolving over the recent past, and how we can think about investment into that value chain. Essentially, how much do we need to put into green hydrogen and what are the risks? So, like I've mentioned, there's been a number of policy approaches. We had the Green Hydrogen Society Roadmap in 2021, which set some provisional targets around electrolysis capacity, green hydrogen production. Then we had, the Green Hydrogen Commercialization Strategy, which I was fortunate to be somewhat involved in, that really sort of lays out, early catalytic projects that we can look at, leveraging industrial policy tools like SEZs, grants, as well as bringing in some key components that perhaps were overlooked before, like the importance of having a demand market, meeting domestic demand and not just having export islands, which is the model that some countries have taken, as well as bringing in the just transition lens into thinking about green hydrogen development. So the result is that in South Africa's experience, we see the beginning of pilot demonstration projects, and a lot of them are well known. I'll list some of them in the next slide. And we also see the rough formation of something of a value chain. So we see some market activity around the input, attempts to localize technology and produce electrolyzers locally, some attempts to get patents and IP around some of the technology, as well as we see some production activities at a sort of demonstration pilot scale. In terms of the off-takers and the downstream consumers, those markets have yet to be formed in any meaningful way, but there is some signals from certain markets and from players that they're interested in being involved in the green hydrogen value chain. A very, very short list of some of the projects. There are much more projects. I haven't listed all of them, but just to give a sense of the types of projects, where they're located, and perhaps what they're targeting. So, for example, there's the Hive Green Ammonia project in the Eastern Cape in Khoza. The idea there is to produce green hydrogen, but also to produce ammonia. The ammonia story comes in particularly when we think about transport. Transporting hydrogen itself is difficult because of the energy density. So you need to compress it or convert it into another chemical form. So it's much easier and cost effective to transport. So there's a focus there on ammonia. There's also a key linkage between ammonia and 5 minutes. Okay. Wow, time goes so fast. There's also a key linkage between ammonia and fertilizer value chains. We have the Prieska Power Reserve project in the Northern Cape, also green hydrogen and ammonia, and like that, a number of other projects. What I don't have here is there's also different stages of the value chain. So, for example, Isono Precious Metals is a firm that's benefited from public, support, from state funding, feasibility support to produce the electrolyzers, so the heart of the equipment as well. So there are a number of projects to try and get the value chain going and to test the use cases specifically. So we are very much at a stage where it's testing, commercial viability of producing some of these products that come out from green hydrogen, as well as testing the ability to scale production based off an initial limited small-scale production. So this all sounds great, and it sounds amazing. And you know, if everything were to go to according to plan, you know, South Africa by 2030, 2035 is a huge green hydrogen player. But unfortunately, we face the reality that we see a lot with new and green and sustainable markets. There's a steep learning curve at the beginning. So as I've mentioned before, most of the potential production, not just in South Africa, but globally, are quite at an early stage. To meet some of the ambitions, you know, the decarbonization ambitions in various plans, like, you know, the NDCs, the Paris Agreement, etc., would actually require the value chain to grow in excess of 90% until 2030, which is really exceeding the growth of solar at its sort of heyday. So to get to some of the ambitions that have been laid down, we really need a rapid growth in green hydrogen development and capacity for it to meaningfully make a difference to our overall decarbonization journey as a planet, right? Several projects, and you know, just recently in the US and in Australia as well, have faced a lot of delays and cancellations for a number of reasons. Some of these reasons include the lack of an off-taker, so a key demand source. Some of them include financing hurdles and the ability to raise finance for the projects and the business models. The lack of incentives or clear and defined incentives for market uptake and project uptake, regulatory uncertainties, licensing and permitting issues, and operational challenges themselves. So, for example, scaling from 1 megawatt from producing a kilo of hydrogen to, say, a ton of hydrogen. We also, and was acknowledged in some of the other presentations, the process is water and energy hungry. So there is a need for available water sources and cheap water sources, and available energy and cheap energy. This is just a diagram summarizing what I've said and some of the issues that arise with projects. So there's a clear uncertainty about the costs and the timelines. And while there are very high ambitions about the development, we have to keep some of these constraints and risks in mind when we think about the development of the value chain and the development of the value chain in South Africa specifically. Cost is another issue in terms of the hydrogen production costs. Currently, depending on where the hydrogen is produced, we're looking at 1.5 to 6 times more costly than the incumbent gray hydrogen production from fossil-based hydrogen. And just to give some context as well, you know, we have our existing hydrogen production is mostly done through Sasol, through gray hydrogen, which is about 2.4 million tons per year. To completely convert that to a green hydrogen system would require about 18 gigawatts of continuous renewable energy. The size of that would be, the size of that solar plant would be like the size of a big city, like Johannesburg, just to give some context to the renewable requirement to feed that level of production. So these are some points that we really need to bear in mind when we think about ambition and we think about how big we want to go in terms of green hydrogen production. There's also a huge capital outlay that's required to produce green hydrogen. The key costs from a capex component come from the electrolyzer itself because there's platinum in it, and the capex cost in terms of your overall costs account of, you know, between 32% of the costs. The rest of it, from an OpEx perspective, is electricity input. This chart is from the IEA, and it just shows sort of the relative costing amongst different technologies. You can see natural gas way on the left. You know, 2023, the most cheapest of the options. You know, between say 3 to 4 kilograms of hydrogen, and this is excluding transport costs, which will add another layer on top of that. All the way to the right, we see that solar PV based hydrogen is still the least cost competitive. So there is some premium that would need to be paid for hydrogen that's produced from completely green sources. So how can we pull this all together? When I present the risks and the challenges, it seems like I'm painting a very dim picture, and it's like, okay, so now this doesn't work. But that's not necessarily the case. So for South Africa, what we need to think about is strategically, where can we get involved and where are the near-term opportunities? It's not the case that all projects should be shelved. However, we need to focus on where there are sort of immediate and low-hanging fruit, to use the cliche, like opportunities in iron and steel, aviation fuel, maritime fuel, ammonia production. The results of some of the demonstration and small-scale projects have yet to come out in any meaningful way. So obviously it is a bit of a waiting game to see how those come out in terms of cost competitiveness and commercial viability. There is some thought that we can perhaps give from the policy side in terms of incentives across the value chain. There has been some support, as I've mentioned, for example, at the input stage, support for feasibility studies, etc., but a bit more of a fine tuning. Another topic that's come up in different ways as well is the just transition. And we also have to accept the reality that project developers in this space are already working against a disadvantage with disparity in costs with the incumbent technology. So layering on just transition initiatives does add an additional constraint on projects, but that needs to be thought out. There are some very interesting tools that project developers so far have been incorporating. So for example, when we did some research around this last year, project developers have community assets that sit within communities. They use these assets to advertise for jobs. They use these assets to get feedback from the community around projects and perhaps the impact of projects as well. And like that, there are a number of opportunities to look at in terms of the overlay of just transition and green hydrogen projects and development. Another quick example is, so for example, when you build your electrolyzers, you can oversize the system such that excess energy can be converted to electricity and be used to provide electricity to communities. Or if you have a desalination system, excess water can be used to provide potable water to surrounding communities. But there are a lot of rules and regulations that need to be navigated before that can happen in any meaningful way. Some of those opportunities also should be explored. We also need firm decisions on the scale of ambition and support. I'm nearly done. Okay, so I'm nearly done. Given that there's a regional focus to this, and this is very provisional, so it still needs to be fleshed out. I thought I could just also look at how we can think about a regional view on green hydrogen. So once we've worked through some of the risks and challenges for South Africa, some of the potential opportunities that we might think about. So we know Namibia is also involved with green hydrogen development. We know that Bukobai, which is an area for development for green hydrogen in South Africa, sits in the Northern Cape. Potential linkages between the ports and the sharing of power and potential hydrogen pipelines could allow us to have a symbiotic relationship with that regional partner, especially when it comes to shipping terminals and transmission lines. I've provided some other examples there, cross-border PGM supply, for example, between South Africa and Botswana to supply a regional fuel cell and electrolyzer industry. So if there's a SADC-like green hydrogen strategy, we can play off of each other's strengths and use that symbiotic relationship strategically. Unfortunately, I can't go through everything because I am out of time, but I will make the presentation available, and I more than look forward to any feedback on it. Ultimately, we are in a stage where it's sort of test and see. There are clear benefits that we may have from being involved in green hydrogen, but I think a more focused lens is being applied now as we see some of the risks and challenges that arise both globally and domestically. Thank you. No.
Thanks, Mohammed. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions around green hydrogen. Our next presentation is by Sithobile Khoza, who will be presenting on leveraging the AfCFTA for renewable energy component manufacturing in Africa.
Good afternoon. Is it afternoon or morning? So I'm just going to wait for my presentation to go on. But as Michael said, I'm an energy analyst at Greencape. So just to start before the presentation does go on, I'll just continue. So the paper looks at leveraging component manufacturing within Africa for renewables specifically. So the paper was developed with a case study that we did before, and the case study looked at export markets that are available for South African component manufacturers. So in looking at that, we look at trade agreements that are available for South Africa and where they could possibly go ahead in terms of exporting at a beneficial rate rather than other countries that do manufacture those products. And I think a big part of that, what we saw is, although we do have regional economic communities, they're not as beneficial as we'd want it to be, because out of the 55 countries, we only identified 5 that renewable component manufacturers can possibly export to at a benefit. And I think 4 of those were under SACU, and it was only beneficial because of solar PVs, because of the 10% import tariff that went in. However, import tariffs also take time to kick in. So it puts manufacturers at a point where they're not sure where they stand in terms of that. So yeah, I'm just going to go through and pause. Is it working? Yes, so I'm just going to skip part the content because this is where we already are. So as I said, 5 markets were picked up that they are beneficial for renewable component manufacturers because they have a tariff specifically for solar panels. So this then is a fragmentation, means that local manufacturers operate below capacity and face challenges in basically competing competitively with other markets that can import into Africa still without tariffs. So as you see, I think there was a lot of talk about the regional communities yesterday, so I'm not going to go through that and bore you with it, but that's my visual there. So, and then just moving on, that's where the African free continental trade then comes in. So this is applying a singular market for these manufacturers. And at this point, it doesn't have to be South African manufacturers, it's manufacturers around the globe. So the tariff liberalization basically means that category A items, which are the ones that fall under renewable component manufacturers in the next 5 years, can go into the market without tariffs, which then gives them a competitive advantage if you look at your likes of markets from Asia or markets from Europe. So that's what the African free continental trade can do for these manufacturers. And I think, therefore, the manufacturing growth in that instance should be focused on in terms of industrial development. And then just a snapshot of manufacturing and where it is currently and the challenges that it faces. And I think just to state that this is manufacturing as a whole, it's not focusing on manufacturing of renewable components. So Africa currently has approximately 10% of its continent's GDP just focusing on manufacturing. And if you look at the global context of the graph, you can see that South Africa and markets like in the West, Nigeria and Ghana, they stand out as the most, although they are above, because they are above average of the 10%. However, if you see markets in the middle, those markets have critical minerals, but no processing or no manufacturing is basically being done in those markets. And then you see that with the gray area. So we know that globally manufacturing can create backward and forward linkages in terms of manufacturing. So in terms of jobs, sorry. So one manufacturing job is estimated to create 3 jobs in other sectors. And I think that type of multiplier effect will be very beneficial if we use the African free continental trade to actually promote manufacturing, not really mostly in the renewable, but just manufacturing in general, and then putting into renewable components in that. And I think the next thing is obviously the transformation potential of regional integration has been seen in the Association of Southern Asian Nations. And I think a speaker in the previous session did touch on that. So we saw that as this agreement came into play, intertrading in those markets shot up. Would it have increased in the process of that? Yes, it probably would have, but not at the rate that free agreements brought into play, because that creates a conducive environment for foreign direct investments, and it gives these markets time to come together to create infrastructure just so their trading is better integrated. And I think that's a big part of what the African free continental trade can do for these manufacturers that are looking into exporting into other markets into Africa. And I think obviously we have to manufacture for someone. So a big part of the renewable component manufacturing is looking at the energy expansion. So So we know that we have electrification goals in Africa. And I think when we speak of manufacturing at some point, we look at large scale only. So if we look at small scale electrification in markets that have a lot of rural communities that don't have really access to the grid, we do have some small scale manufacturing that can happen in these markets that they don't need to import those products. So as the market grows in terms of solar and wind, we see that there's a need for components such as your solar PVs, wind turbines, inverters, and batteries. And installed capacity energy in Africa is rapidly growing. And then this increasing demand is providing a substantial market for these components. And I think that can be seen in terms of the imports that are coming in for these certain components. So if you look at the graph, I think it will be my right-hand side and your left. If you look, that's an African context of how selected products. So we looked at solar PV, we looked at lithium accelerators, and then there's generators, which offer wind power. So you can see those three components, there's a lot of imports coming in, and these panels are already coming in assembled. And we can possibly do assembly and capture that market and making sure some manufacturing is happening in Africa. And then just in the South African context, we can also see that there is imports coming in. This is just a grouping of the previous components that are mentioned in terms of Africa. So I think another thing that we did note is that even though the exports for South Africa of renewable components, most of them are going into Africa. So basically there is a market, right? There is a market for these components, but we just need to accelerate and scale up. Because at the end of the day, I think we all know that in terms of the production, there has to be substantial need to sustain a market of renewable components. And obviously, if South Africa can do it alone, if Botswana cannot do it alone, it's very important that the capacity comes from everyone in the continent, so everyone can benefit not only from the manufacturing, but ensuring that we have these products to supply to the growing energy. And I think, well, this one is a bit complex. I think looking at the strategic approaches of how we can then manufacturing, I'm just going to touch on a few in the interest of time. So basically, this was developed looking at the South African Renewable Master Plan. So it involves the Black SA, which basically is still South Africa. So in the context of Africa, we will look at African countries as the green. So just to touch on the local manufacturer, looking at toll and licensing, which is at the top in the middle. So this basically means functioning where the IP still belongs to a country. So we're not developing our own technology. I think that's maybe some points that we have a problem with. We think that we have to develop our own technology. IPs can still remain with the makers and African markets that are in Asia or markets that are in Europe. So what we do in terms of toll is we produce on contract. So if I'm company Z and I need to do a development and I'm installing, I go to Solar Canada, for instance, and I say, I need your technology, but my technology has to have some form of local content. So I then go to a market, your Solar Africa, which is in Africa, and then I ask them to produce that technology for me. So what happens is you still get the local content, you still get your rules of origin, and then you can export that into Africa. So that's toll. And then in terms of licensing, I'm in Solar Africa and the markets that I'm in Africa function, and I go to Solar Canada and I say, there's a market of 5 developers that need this product. So what I will do is I buy your licensing, I produce that technology because that's the technology they want. That's the quality that we want. If we can't produce it ourselves in terms of developing the new technology and quality, then we look at someone who can and then bring it here. And that way we are creating jobs. We're still keeping the rules of origin. We're still meeting local content. And I think another one is looking at local partnerships with manufacturers. This is not a form of subsidiary, but it's when a company from outside of Africa takes a company that's in Africa and helps that company develop and producing the goods that they have and then improving the ones that they're already manufacturing. So again, manufacturing is still happening. We're still providing quality technology. However, that technology, we don't have to own the IP. So we're not developing any new technologies, but there's still a form of manufacturing. And then I think just to look at the final one, just look at local partnerships. So what local partnerships does is a manufacturer from Canada is allowed to rent a line in a manufacturing firm in Africa. So they manage that line, right? So that keeps that manufacturing company that's manufacturing at a small scale, it keeps them in business. However, they still have that line, they still have money coming in because that line that's owned by Solar Canada is using employees from an African context. So that creates jobs in that instance. So I think I'm just going to move it forward and to move it into the recommendations. So I think I'm just going to focus on the first one, which is fostering regional value chains. So as you see on the graph here, we have a simple solar panel value chain. So we have your polysilicon, you have your ingot, you have your wafer, you have your cell. So if you take a cell, for instance, a cell has that wafer. That wafer has 5 more components that go into it. And I think when we look at value chains, we look at wanting to capture the whole value chain, whereas what we need to do is squeeze it in. So we look at where African markets can fit into one singular value chain, and then we put them there. So I think a speaker yesterday mentioned the example of the Airbus, right? You have the wing, you have your tail. None of those, the Airbus cannot function with those. So that's what we need to do. We need to find where we can benefit in terms of the value chains. And this is just not for solar components only. You're looking at your batteries, we have critical minerals. You're looking at your wind turbines. There's a steel economy for all of that. You're looking at when you're going to plants, there's concrete for that. So there is there is markets for that we can actually capture the value chain on that. And I think that's the most important thing. And then that's the work that we find ourselves doing right now, is kind of looking at where Africa fits into the value chain of each component or each final product that goes into renewable manufacturing, and how we can then benefit from that. And I think next then is facilitating investments and funding. We've spoken to a number of production or manufacturers that actually function in the renewable space. And I think a big part of it, there is a need for them to upscale, but obviously investments are far and not near to them. So there is a need to say that if we want to take industries through the African free continental trade, we need to engage them in the African free continental trade, because I don't think we can promote something that's for the industry when the industry is not involved. So there's a big part of, there's a focus on that and making sure that we have enhancing, and then they can afford the financing that comes into play. And then lastly is just strengthening and harmonizing the policy framework. So basically looking at how we implement the African free continental trade all together to benefit. So I think a big part is we do function separately. So we need to make sure that when the African free continental trade, an industry that focuses on renewable component manufacturing in Zambia, and an industry that focuses on renewable components in Kenya, has the same framework, so everybody can function under the FCCA without any issues and without any discrepancies, of making sure that there's development and coherent regional manufacturing. So I think I'm just going to end there. So a bunch of our work does focus on the renewable energy sector. And I think if you scan the QR code, you'll be able to go into the library, and then you'll see the first study that fit into this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sithobile. Really something to think about. So we'll open the floor now for some Q&A. I would like to request those who do have questions to be very specific on who you're directing it to, just not me, please. And so I first want to check if there's any questions online before we take some questions in the room. Any questions online? Okay, please send them to me. All right. Okay, so I'll just take, we've got one question from online. I don't think it's direct, I think it might be directed at you, Dale. So the question is, one of my concerns about African component manufacturing, sorry, Sithobile, not Dale, about African manufacturing is about having a demand market. If African countries cannot ensure policy consistency, then this won't work. For example, the SA REAP is one old example, but currently the SA government cannot even put together an IRP or IRP and an IEP that is aligned to the Paris Agreement. So in this case, how do we ensure there is some form of demand?
Thank you for the question. I think when we look at industry, we have set a mark where there's 4 gigawatts that's needed for a sustainable market in terms of producing renewable components. So that does not have to come from public, it can also come from private. And I think the first reason why we did the study is because we figured out that South Africa alone cannot produce this 4 gigawatts on a yearly basis. So you look then into your neighbors, right? We all have goals that we want to achieve in terms of increasing our solar uptake, increasing wind. So it doesn't have to be public. I know REAP has a few problems, but that demand can come from private. And I think even though REAP has not worked here, African markets are constantly investing and getting grants to increase the uptake of solar. So that's the reason why we need to look at the African Free Continental Trade as a reason to kind of push for this manufacturing, because that's where the demand will come from. If South Africa is providing at private capacity, we can look at government in terms of government in Zambia, right? So they have basically projects that are coming into play that actually serve as a demand. So the demand doesn't have to come from South Africa. That's why we extend it into export markets. I hope I answered that.
Thank you, Sithobile. Are there any questions? I see a couple of hands. I think we'll take it like this. So we'll start over here, and then we can go to the table here in front, and then there's another one behind there. And then
thanks. I'd like to ask Muhammed Patel a question. First of all, just to say I appreciated the information and also the tone of realism behind his paper. But I wanted to ask that in, shall I say, less sober presentations that I've heard, the big advantage that is held out why Namibia and the Northern Cape are, particularly well placed is the sunlight, which is supposed to be much better than Europe or whatever. But now you've pointed out that these are also areas where there's water as a problem. And climate change tells us that these areas are going to become more water scarce. And so you put in there that it's desalination. Now, my little understanding is that desalination is pretty expensive. And I want to ask, has anybody done the math? If you have to desalinate the water and then electrolyze it, does that still make the abundant sunlight compared to Europe or whatever, does that still make that a competitive advantage, or does that negate the competitive advantage? Thanks.
Could we take one more and then?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll give some time to answer.
Good morning. I'm Michael Indiolana from the Atlanta Special Economic Zone, and I really enjoyed the presentations that focused about value chain integration. So we've grown our pipeline to include e-waste manufacturing firms, battery manufacturers. However, in the context of South Africa's fiscal climate, what should entities such as SEZs do if they have 5 funding applications for factories to go through and the DTIC, for example, only approves 2? What other means are there for infrastructure or industrial sites to access capital, which would still provide the same value that the grant funding from the DTIC does?
You can go ahead and answer the question directed at you, and then we can go from there.
No, thanks. Thanks for the question on desalination. I think it's a good one. I myself wrote a paper some years back. I won't say trashing desalination, but highlighting the risks of desalination as a route for water supply in the country. So when people first started advocating for desalination in green hydrogen production, I was also very skeptical because I was asking exactly the same questions. Like desalination is highly capital intensive, highly energy intensive. You're bolting that on to another process that's highly capital intensive, highly energy intensive. Surely that's going to make a material impact on the final hydrogen cost. Turns out, though, that because of the scale of the cost of green hydrogen, the water supply component, even with desalination, makes a very little difference in the final price of green hydrogen produced. We're talking about 1% or 2% difference in the overall price, which seems counterintuitive. But when you look at the overwhelming costs of the electrolyzers and the energy input that's required for the electrolysis process, that this desalination cost dilutes the water. It disappears, right? That being said, that's only one aspect of desalination. There are other aspects of desalination that are problematic. So desalination, if you're using seawater as your input and you're desalinating seawater, you're left with huge amounts of brine, right? What do you do with that brine? Now, there's a huge case to be made against disposing of the brine back into the sea, because that has a catastrophic effect on the local ecosystems, and it's a problem. It's a huge problem, and it messes up marine life, etc. So then, now producers are looking to, can we get an off-taker for the salt? Can we co-locate next to perhaps a salt factory or something like that? But these risks need to be borne in mind. So to answer your question, given the overwhelming cost of the capex of electrolyzers and the energy costs, the desalination cost ends up accounting for very little in the economic model of green hydrogen production. But there are still other issues related to using desalination processes as part of the water input. I was surprised as well.
I think the financing question for manufacturers is something that I haven't covered, but I'll just do my best to answer it. I think what we look at is making sure that some form of direct investment or foreign direct investment is involved into companies that are coming into the SEZ. And I think an SEZ also plays a role in terms of being attractive to these markets. So you obviously, SEZ have to form some form of benefits to actually make sure that I'm willing to invest into an SEZ and establish myself, because whether I have a tax incentive, whether I'm paying less for electricity somewhere else. So I think the attractiveness should come from both. So I want a foreign direct investment, I look for investors and I got it, but then what benefit do I have in being in an SEZ that's focusing on being a green SEZ rather than just me being closer to the port somewhere else in the market? So I hope that answers some part of your question, but I think obviously there's a lot of focus on basically financing projects rather than financing manufacturers, and I think that's where the gap is in that instance. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any more questions here? I think you do have mic. Okay.
No.
You can go.
Thank you very much. And this goes to Madam Khoza. You made a recommendation on leveraging the public procurement for local content. Is it that the conception behind it is to avoid any limitations that the trade policy tools provide? So that, again, procurement in this case, you would have governments playing a bigger role in those transactions. Maybe you can give me the rationale behind that recommendation. The last part has to do with what you have presented. Does cost variance analysis have a place in determining where the production would be made? So if I look at highly productive countries like China, and I try to look at the costs of coming up with, whether it be the solar panels, should that also be factored in to say, how would it look like if it were to be done, in an African setting? And therefore, to an extent that you have a little bit of disadvantage in terms of competitiveness, should policy play a place in ensuring that somehow you still are able to harvest production that would happen within the continent, vis-a-vis, letting it to the forces of competition in terms of those countries that are a little bit more competitive than we are? Thanks.
Can I just answer before I
Yes,
forget?
it's a very long question. You can go ahead and
So I think in looking at local content, it provides comfortability for manufacturers to be able to come and set up shop here. So what local content does is my product has to have some form of South African in it, in order for it to go into a plant. So that's your comparative advantage compared to someone who's still manufacturing in India. And then in terms of the cost analysis, you look at your tariffs. So that's where your tariffs come in, right? If my product is at the same price as a Chinese product while I'm manufacturing here, right, the tariff that will incur for a Chinese manufacturer increases their price, therefore increasing my comparative advantage while I'm functioning in an African context. Because my product is moving freely, whereas the Chinese product is coming in with that additional 10% or that additional 5%. So I think also another thing is when you look at that instance, if Chinese manufacturers invest into Africa, they will ensure that their cost is still as low as possible, although the manufacturing is still happening here. So the cost component is not a factor. So what we try to do is bring them here so they have a market that does not have a tariff and does not increase their does not decrease their competitiveness. And I hope I covered both those questions.
Are there any? There's another hand there, and there's someone. So you can go.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this discussion. It's really thought-provoking. I've got two questions. The first one relates to just energy transition. I really like the approach that you said that we should have a test and see approach. But my concern is more on non-financial and capacity building. I just want us to check if there was any environmental impact assessment studies done in terms of communicating those strategies to communities, because from my experience, when the anyway, let me not take much of your time. The second question is with regards to the issue of local content and country of origin. Where does beneficiation feature in that regard? Because my concern is that once a country come with an IP, they will still continue to have that asymmetric relations in terms of the ownership of the intellectual property. So those are the issues that I wanted to raise. Finally, the issue of policy. Was there any thought in terms of the unintended consequences of policy? Because policy on its own may have some unintended consequences. Thank you.
The policy question, was it directed at someone specifically? Because there was two, all of them included some form of policy. Okay, so either one of you can then answer. Could we take another person and then, okay. Yeah.
Hi. I have a question. It's just for clarification. I might have missed what you said actually. But you were talking about only 5 or 6 countries in Africa. Yeah. Could you just explain why is it only 5 or 6? I didn't really understand the reason.
Okay, could we go with the first set of questions, I assume, and then the second question?
Okay, maybe I can start. So I'm not sure if the initial part of the question was, does the EIA process require community consultation? Is that, yeah, so yeah, typically it would. My understanding is that it would. But just to also shed some light on, so when we did some earlier work around trying to explore the overlap between green hydrogen projects and just transition tools, so the extent to which just transition mechanisms or tools are featuring in green hydrogen projects. The community engagement aspect really varies from project developer to project developer. Some project developers take the option of, as I mentioned, having a community asset. So they have someone that's in the community surrounding the production site. And this is used as a conduit to mobilize people, to engage, to advertise jobs, to advertise specific roles where they may need assistance in the plant, and to the level where they set aside a specific budget for this when they do their financial planning. But there's a spectrum. Some project developers do this. Some project developers don't really do this. There's no specific requirement. I mean, over and above legislative processes, right? That require engagement. And just to also shed some light, some of the community concerns that have arisen in the course of green hydrogen projects and development. We try to explore that as well. You know, for example, some communities are afraid of hydrogen. They hear that it's very, you know, explosive, and they worry about those elements of projects, which is not completely unfounded. There are safety risks to hydrogen. Some community members are worried about expansion. So is a project going to start small and suddenly now it's going to encroach more and more onto their community land? That's another element that was raised. Some community members feel like they'd like a demonstration of what exactly is this, you know, what are you doing here? So these are some of the things that came up in the course of the research. I can't remember your second question. If you could just, your second question was? Oh, yeah. So I mean, as part, so I guess as part of the larger, from a policy angle, right, the policy formation process, you know, there are certain tools that we use to try and attend to specifically that. What are the unintended consequences? And the way typically one way that we may do this is for a given policy issue, we look at, you know, amongst the various stakeholders that are involved or impacted, you know, what are the benefits to them of a certain policy measure? What are the costs to them? What are the implementation requirements? So that kind of lens does come through in the policy analysis for us as researchers. So I'm answering that from the vantage point of policy researchers, right?
To answer your question with regards to my paper and the policy that I'm recommending, my main concern when I wrote the paper, when I thought of it, when I rationalized it, was that no one gets left behind. Not everybody can just start a carbon tax policy within their sovereign countries. So the idea behind it is that each country controls or determines their own start point, but we all agree at the end point, and that's where the AfCFTA comes in. That way, and by using a phased-in approach, which is what South Africa is using currently, no one will get left behind. The only thing is that we need a consensus, and that's why we need the AfCFTA framework to reach a consensus as to when is the end, what is the end game? Where do we want to be? So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
So I think just to answer the 5 markets, so what the case study did was look at South Africa specifically. So what we did is then look at where South Africa can export at a benefit of trade agreements. So that gives you SACU and that gives you SADC. However, the reason why we got 5 markets is because SACU trades as one. So there was a 10% tariff that was put on solar panels, which then means manufacturers in South Africa have those 4 markets at a benefit. Another market that stood out was Zambia, because they had already also put in a 10% tariff for solar panels. So that's how we got those 5 markets in terms of having a comparative advantage. All the other markets, we do have trade agreements with them. However, there isn't a tariff that makes us better off compared to a market that's producing outside of Africa. And I think that's where we got to the 5 markets, and I hope that's a better understanding to your question.
We've got time for 2 more questions, if they are brief, please. Okay, just not loaded ones. So if they are brief, we've got time for 2 more.
Cool, I will be brief. So mine is to Muhammed and Sithobile as well. Did your work look at the skills required and where we are as a continent to meet those demands? Because these are great ambitions to be able to produce and supply these markets, but do we have the skills and the ability to meet those demands? And lastly, to Muhammed, I think one of the bugbears, especially with green hydrogen, which has been experienced, is the balance between energy security and our ambition to develop our green hydrogen projects. And so in your work, where are we at the moment with that? And do you see that we are reaching parity soon? Or should Africa firstly focus on solving our energy security before moving so hectically towards green industrialization? Thank you.
We can answer, and then we can take the next one.
Okay, the first question. To answer the first question, we haven't. I haven't been involved in research doing it at a regional or continental scale, but I certainly can provide some comment on a kind of South African-based scale. So when we were looking at a project that we did with the South African Institute for International Affairs, SIA, and the British High Commission, it was looking at the skills mismatch in green hydrogen. So, for example, we see this new value chain emerging, which is going to have a requirement for certain types of skills, and our analysis was mainly focused on the technical and vocational skills, it was then trying to assess, what is the demand for roles going to be, and what is the extent to which the current technical and vocational system can provide those roles. And what we saw is that in the development of the green hydrogen value chain, you are going to see a number of new roles across the value chain. So at the input stage, you need people that are going to be assembling the membrane electrode stacks that are used in electrolyzers. You need people that are going to be painting on the catalysts onto the equipment, etc. New roles, right, that are not currently available in the economy. At the production stage, there's some roles that are transferable. So like a boiler maker is a boiler maker, they just need to be trained to work on a hydrogen line, or someone that's monitoring the pressure on a gas line. They have the skills already, but there are also in that new skills that will arise, etc., across the value chain. If you're looking at downstream uses, for example, heavy duty vehicles, you need someone that can work with a fuel cell based engine. So like that, there will be a lot of roles and labor demand. And then the question is now, is the current education supply system able to contribute to that? At the time, which was in 2021, there was still a significant reorientation that needed to happen in the TVET technical vocational system. There was huge appetite for that, but back then, the training programs weren't geared towards that. So that is a process that needs to move forward, and is obviously has to be supported by policy and other stakeholders in the space, like the CETAs, for example, to align the needs of industry and industrial players with the labor supply system. So that's just to provide some insight. I can't give it to you at a continental level because I simply don't have the answer for that. Sorry, I got involved in answering that question and again forgot your second question. So can you just tell me again what your second question was?
It was directed at.
Oh, okay, it's fine. Okay, so I'm done. It's fine.
I think mine was also on the skills. I just want to echo what Muhammad said as well. I think there was a misalignment in terms of the TVET, in terms of the jobs that are needed on the field. And I think we are lucky enough to be able to participate in terms of skills research and skills development in the work that we do. And part of it has been going mostly into the solar PV manufacturing. And I think that one was easy to uptake, or that one is easy to study because there is some form of solar PV manufacturing or assembly that's currently happening in South Africa at the current moment in time. Again, to the African context, I cannot speak to it. I do work a lot in the South African market. And I think that's sorry for that. And I think in the African continent, as I said, I cannot answer to that. But then there's a lot of skills work that we do in terms of trying to match people that are looking for certain skills that can match them to certain courses. And I think, I'm not sure if anyone has heard of that, we have an app called Power Up, where actually people are actually able to go on that app and see qualifications and what those qualifications need and what type of jobs you can get within the green economy. So I think that's the work that we're doing. That's the context that this work was also done at, that there is skill development being done in the manufacturing sector for renewable components.
Okay, so that's fine. We've got time for like one more question and before we wrap up. Is there anything? None? Okay.
I think just to remind Mohammed, I'd asked about the energy security versus green hydrogen.
Sorry, Mohammed, my fault.
And priority.
Yeah, sorry, man. I forgot my notebook. You know, I'm being a very bad panel member. Yeah, the energy security question. So that's a very important question, right? So I mean, okay, so let's break it down. So we're talking about green hydrogen, which means we have a renewable energy input, right? We don't want a situation, for example, where we create an export hub, where we have renewable energy producing green hydrogen, we're exporting that, but we've got energy security issues in the country. So the idea of additionality comes in very strongly when in the discourse, and it comes through as well in the commercialization strategy, the green hydrogen commercialization strategy. The idea being that you want to make sure that your domestic energy needs are met first before you're using any energy source to produce an export good. You know, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot as a country if you can't provide energy and electricity to your domestic citizens, but you can have a sort of either producing it for domestic use or even just for export. So that principle is one that's very strong, and it comes through in the policy discourse as well. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. It's a key priority to not ignore your domestic energy needs.
On that note, I'd like to thank everyone for attending the session. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I'm sure they'll stick around during lunch if you've got any burning questions or any questions that perhaps weren't answered. On that note, I would like everyone to give our panelists a round of applause, and then we'll close. Thank you.